Hello, everyone. Welcome to Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 5, or the discussion chapter. A couple things before we get started. We do have a support person online with us who will help you with any technical issues you're having, or can answer questions about the availability of the presentations. The presentations, you will all get one, and they're also available. They're archived on our website, and I believe we also have a YouTube channel that they're on as well. As far as questions, as we go through the webinar, if you have questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat box or the question and answer box, so you don't forget, but I won't get to them until the end. So just to let you know that. Okay, so the discussion chapter, first thing to do, and I'm going to say this several times throughout the presentation, is if you don't already have it, obtain your school's template or guidelines for the dissertation, and for obviously the chapter 5 or the discussion chapter. You're going to want to follow your school's guidelines as best you can, especially regarding the content and the headers, the sections. Now, having said that, the content of the discussion chapter are pretty standard. So the one I'm going to show you today is a pretty good general guideline or template, but schools sometimes do have particularities. Sometimes the order of the sections are a little different, or they call the section headers something a little different. So it's always best to just to have specifically what your school wants. Okay. Chapter 5, sometimes the discussion chapter can be, it depends on your school. Again, sometimes dissertations have 6 chapters, more than 5 chapters. But the discussion chapter, let's just call it the discussion, is where you are going to discuss and interpret your findings, and also do things like make recommendations for practice and recommendations for further research. Okay, so here's generally the typical sections and content for the discussion chapter: introduction, interpretation of the findings, sometimes also called the discussion of the findings, limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for further study, summary, which some schools don't require a summary. So again, another good reason to get a hold of your school's template if you don't have it already. Okay, the introduction. Just like the introduction of other chapters, you want to reorient your reader about what you're doing. Okay, so it's always helpful to restate your purpose, remind the reader of the importance of your study or why it was needed. Okay, really just reorient them. And if you want, you can preview the contents of the chapter. Sometimes even schools will require a brief summary of your results at the end of the introduction, or you can put it in the next section. If your template specifies, do what your template specifies. But as far as just summarizing the results, you can do it at the end of the introduction or in the beginning of the interpretation of the findings section. This is really the heart of the chapter, of the discussion chapter, where you're going to be discussing your findings, interpreting them. What does it mean to discuss your findings? This is a big question that a lot of students have. They're not really sure. It sounds like you get to kind of interpret the findings any way that you see them, but that's not really correct. So what you really want to do is set up a discussion of what you found based on previous research. Okay, so a lot of this has to do with going back to some of the major findings of major previous studies in chapter 2, seeing what people found, comparing that to what you found, noting whether your findings support previous research, where they don't support previous research, and setting up a discussion based on that previous research. This is in organizing this section is kind of important, and it will help you if you understand how to organize it as a writer. It will also help the reader. So if you're quantitative, your study is quantitative, just section it out by research questions. Okay, research question 1, research question 2. Lay out your research questions, summarize what you found. And the discussion chapter is kind of a plain spoken chapter. I mean, all the statistics and the numbers are in chapter 4 or your results chapter. So there's not so much statistics in the discussion chapter. It's really kind of a plain spoken way to talk about your findings. So we don't need a lot of statistics. Again, section it out by research questions, summarize your research questions, bring in the previous research on what you found, note where your findings support or don't support. If your findings support previous research, you can usually make some kind of conclusion based on that. That means that your finding confirms what previous researchers have found. So that's pretty conclusive evidence that whatever it is you're studying, you can make conclusions based on that. If your findings don't support, that's fine. Sometimes people get upset that, it doesn't support the previous research. What do I do? It's like, that's fine. I mean, that's what research is about. You're seeing what you're getting. You would want to note that, but that also means that you can't really make conclusions then, because it suggests a degree of inconclusiveness, right? If your findings are different or at odds kind of with previous research, note that. And there's some kind of there's a degree of inconclusiveness there. Also, it may suggest, which we'll get to later, a need for more research on the topic because there's not conclusiveness. And if your findings are don't support previous research, you usually want to give a reason for that. Or, what, and it's something that can be proved, but it's going to be your kind of your take on why you think your findings were different. And you can bring in previous research if that helps you make the point. Sometimes it has to do with population. You studied a different population than was studied by previous researchers. So that may have explained the difference in findings. So some kind of explanation of different findings is usually expected. If your study is qualitative, take this section and subsection it out based on your themes. Usually qualitative studies reveal themes. Same thing, kind of lay out your theme, summarize it, talk about it a little bit, and then bring in previous research. Just set up a discussion noting where how your research fits in, whether it supports or doesn't support. Right, and so this takes going back to chapter 2. Okay, let's see. I think I could. Oh, right. Also, if your findings add something new, novel, you definitely want to mention that. Okay. Also, if you're doing a mixed method study, you would probably want to have separate sections, maybe for your quantitative results and then for your qualitative results. And usually sometimes in mixed method studies, the qualitative portion is meant to kind of help explain or go a little deeper than what the quantitative portion can do. So usually that's part of it too, kind of elaborating a little bit on how the qualitative results kind of help explain and help inform the quantitative results. Okay, before staying with the interpretation section, there's also the question of your theory or your theoretical framework or your conceptual framework. should you bring that in to discuss in the discussion section? Ideally, yes. I mean, I've seen people not bring in their theory, just relate their findings to the findings of previous research and have perfectly fine discussions. So I'm gonna kind of leave it on up to you on a case-by-case basis, and also talk to in conjunction with your chair. Sometimes the theories are, I mean, ideally the theories are there to help explain what you did, to help explain your findings. So or sometimes maybe your findings add to the theory or kind of modify our understanding of the theory. That's worth noting as well. So if it seems like the theory is really going to help you with the discussion, definitely include the theory, or obviously if your school requires that or your chair wants you to, try to incorporate discussion of the theory in there. And there's two ways to do this. You can either kind of fold the theoretical concerns in where they're appropriate into these subsections, or you can have a completely separate subsection, something like links to theory or connection to theory, where you can discuss your findings in relation to the theory. Okay, the next section is limitations. And it's really just like it sounds. Was there anything in your studies that limited your ability to, or affected your results? Usually in chapters 1 and chapter 3, you have to talk about of your proposal potential limitations that you might encounter before you're kind of forecasting before you conduct your study. Here's things that might act as limitations. So it's helpful to go back to those chapters to see if any of those things that you thought might have been limitations actually ended up being limitations. So that's the place to start. But again, anything that may have influenced your results or affected your results. For quantitative studies, a big limitation is if you didn't get the sample size that you needed. Say you needed 80 participants, you only got 40. Well, that's pretty significant, because it reduces what they call your G power, and that means your study's underpowered, and so the statistical certainty of your results are weak. So quantitative studies being underpowered is a big limitation for quantitative studies. Sometimes you can't get the actual people that you wanted, the population you wanted, so you have to use a different set of folks. That can affect the results. So anything like that, or maybe you had to use a proxy, some kind of proxy construct you weren't able to measure exactly what you wanted to measure. You had to use a proxy. Those kind of things would be needed to be discussed, because what you're doing is you're letting your reader know that, yeah, there were some issues here. They may have influenced the results. So we need to, look at the results and interpret the results with these limitations in mind. For qualitative studies, typical limitations involve bias. Sometimes it's like researcher bias, maintaining objectivity. And, you can include that, but you should also include some ways that you help to mitigate bias. Sometimes there's things called member checking, where you ask your members your participants to check their answers to make sure they're accurate, that you transcribe them accurately, and they've been, put forth accurately. Another section to the limitations, they usually want you to describe or discuss generalizability of your results here to the larger population. So given, your sample of the population, how well will what you found generalize to the larger population? And if your study is quantitative and you had the proper number of participants or more, generally your findings are going to generalize pretty well. For qualitative studies, generalizability isn't really an issue. It's something you're going to have to discuss, but qualitative studies necessarily have low sample sizes because you're doing things like interviews. And so generalizability isn't really the objective of qualitative research. The objective is to get in-depth, information, rich information that you can't get with quantitative studies. But that's worth mentioning that as a qualitative study, your results won't generalize well, but they're not really meant to. They're meant to get a certain kind of information, like I said, in-depth information that you can't get with quantitative studies. Okay, let's see. Implications for practice. All right, remember, there's some part of the reason why we do studies is to give us information so we can use that information, right? And one of the ways that we can use it is practically. So what does it mean for people in your area that you studied? What does it mean for them on the ground at the level of practice? How can your data, your results, what you found, how can it inform what they do? That's really what this section is about. And here you can be specific. Does it mean that, we need in a certain area more professional development, for example? If we found out that, let's say, emotional intelligence, teachers need emotional intelligence. It helps them to be better teachers. Well, then you could, practical implications that follow from that is give them, seminars, give them professional development on emotional intelligence. What does that look like? Seminars, workshops. That's what I mean by you can get specific here. You can get kind of nuts and bolts. Make sure that the implications for practice, the things that you're talking about, they stem from your findings. They're not general recommendations or implications. If you're doing an education study and you say, teachers need to be paid more, I mean, that's great, but if you didn't study that, it doesn't pertain to what you found. So make sure they stem from your findings. And again, you can be specific, it's kind of nuts and bolts, practice, does it mean meetings, professional development, seminars, workshops, encouragement from superiors, things like that. Okay. And for some of these sections, coming to this webinar is a great idea. Going online and looking at other resources is a great idea. Talking to your chair obviously is good, but sometimes getting an approved dissertation in your area from your school, just to look at as an example to see how people have handled some of these sections is really, really helpful. Okay, recommendations for further research. Again, you did a study, conducted a study to get information. What are we going to do with that information? How can the information be valuable? One of the ways is practical knowledge. The other one is how do your results, your findings, what you found, how does it impact research? How can it contribute to the research? How can it contribute to the body of knowledge? And what are the recommendations, based on what you found? What do you recommend that future researchers look at? And this is based on two things. It's based on obviously on your findings. It can also be based to some degree on your limitations. So for example, if you had a limitation of, you had a low sample size, right? And so your study was underpowered, which, like I said, kind of undercuts or kind of diminishes your statistical certainty. Well, one of the recommendations you can make is to replicate the study and ensure that it has an adequate sample size. So that's an example of a recommendation being based on the limitation. Most of your recommendations are probably going to come from your findings, though. So and here's some examples. Any findings that don't support previous research, that suggests some degree of inconclusiveness. So you can kind of generally recommend more research in that area. Any findings that are novel or new, definitely would warrant further exploration and further examination. You can also recommend different types of studies to get different kinds of information. Say you had a quantitative study and is a correlational design, which is to determine if there's a relationship between two factors or two constructs, two or more. That's great. So you found that there is a relationship between construct A and construct B. Well, you might want to then recommend different kinds of studies on it to find out more about that relationship, maybe even qualitative studies. Ask people, get more kind of in-depth information on that. There's things like longitudinal studies. These are studies over time. Sometimes those can be helpful, again, to get different kinds of information on things like processes that occur over time. So different types of studies you can also recommend on what you've done to get different information. Those are just some kind of examples. And again, check your template, because some schools let you end there. Other schools, you have a summary or a conclusion. And so in one way, it's like summaries of other chapters, and in another way, it's different. So in the way that it's similar is that you're going to recap major points from the chapter. The way that it's different is that it's the conclusion of the summary to the entire dissertation. So you're going to have that kind of closure to it too. And really what you want to do is leave the reader with a take-home message. And that is really like the most important points from your study that you want them to remember. And that's it. Again, this is kind of a general discussion of the chapter 5, a general overview. But if you have questions, I don't see any questions now in the question box, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And this is our, if you want to talk to somebody about what we do and potentially signing on for assistance, here's our contact information. Okay, any questions? Okay, no questions? All right, well, if there are no questions, I want to thank you for attending. And we run different seminars on different chapters on different topics every week. So just check our calendar, see what we're doing at what week. And, if you need, think you need other seminars to attend, you're welcome to sign on to those as well. Okay, great. Okay, you're welcome. All right. Have a good day, rest of your day, everybody. Take care and good luck. Thank you.